Well, thank you for coming tonight, and I want to thank, again, East Lake Community Church for hosting this. It's a big deal. It affects everybody. It's a community thing, and there's not a better place to do this than in this wonderful, beautiful church. My name is Bill Brush, and I'm the president and founder of Cut Unnecessary Regulatory Burden. We founded this organization back in April 12th, 2011. It's a Virginia corporation, a 501c4, and it's registered with the IRS, not that it had to be, but it is registered with the IRS for the purposes of donations. In other words, donations can be made to C.U.R.B, and they're not discoverable. C.U.R.B really doesn't have members. C.U.R.B has donors and supporters. It's run by our board of directors, 4 of us, but again, if you make donations to C.U.R.B, we did it this way for a particular purpose because a lot of folks are concerned about pushback or from AEP on issues, and we figured to be anonymous was probably the best way to go. So what I'm going to do tonight is talk about a little bit about the history of regulation here at the project, how it started, where we are, talk about what we think some of the issues are where AEP probably is violating their license requirements, and then we're going to finish up with a discussion about where we are with this current lawsuit and how things are going. So back in 1960, AEP negotiated what they call flowage easements with every property owner that on the lake or for every bit of land on the lake. I don't know of any properties on this lake that do not have a flowage easement that goes along with it. And the purpose for that flowage easement was to allow AEP to flood a portion of that land on the lake up to the 800-foot contour occasionally, and down at Leesville as high as 620 feet. The easement is nothing more than a land contract. It's between the grantor, the landowner, and the power company. They gave the power company the right to flood and to clear material and debris and so forth out of the project boundary as they built the lake for the sole purpose of building a dam, impounding waters, and operating a power station on the lake. The landowners retained all their rights to use this easement in any way they wanted to, so long as it didn't impact AEP's ability to flood that easement. And it wasn't something that was inconsistent with the rights that they were granted to flood. That's a big deal, and when you think about that, the actual easement itself reads that you can use it for any purpose you want to, just so long as you do not impact their ability to generate electricity and flood the project. Every bit of shoreline, like I said earlier, is under a flowage easement. AEP probably owns about 20% of the land along the shoreline right now. The rest is owned by you and others under flowage easements that guarantee you the right to use the project for recreational purposes. Well, back in 1960, at the same time they were negotiating these flowage easements, they also applied to the Federal Power Commission and were issued a 50-year license to construct and operate the project. There was no requirement at that point in time to regulate shorelines, docks, or any private use of the shoreline or land within the project boundary. It just wasn't a requirement of the license, and nobody at that point in time really even cared, including the counties, who didn't realize at the time that what this lake was going to really develop into. Back on the 17th of May in 1967, Appalachian was required to deliver a set of drawings that described what the project was, the project boundary. And in that drawing, they certified that they had the property rights to implement their license. They had to certify that to the Federal Power Commission, or else they wouldn't have been given a license. They wouldn't have been allowed to operate. And that particular requirement, when they filed that, took every parcel that they had bought on this project or in this project and detailed it by the boundary that it was, the actual area where these ownership rights were, by lease. They showed which ones were they owned in fee simple and which ones were under only a flowage easement at the time. And they described the various types of flowage easements. These were very detailed drawings showing every subdivision by parcel. In 1970, I bring this up because people always will ask, well, why are they worried about this stuff now, about regulating shoreline, if in the original license they didn't have to? Well, back in 1970, in December of 70, the National Environmental Policy Act became a reality, and the EPA was formed to oversee clean air, clean water, and other attributes. Some can argue that it was an overreaching thing, but since 1970, believe me, our rivers, our lakes, our air are cleaner than they were back in those days. But there is a cost. Every regulation that's implemented, there's costs associated with that. And today we debate these costs all the time. In 1977, 7 years later, the Federal Power Commission was converted to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It took a 3-letter word and made it into a 4-letter word, FERC, FERC. And that's when we started to see FERC take control of some projects where it started to regulate licenses and require licensees to start to regulate shoreline in these projects in 1980. The first one was someplace in Texas where they started this process. In 1986, Congress implemented a change to the Federal Power Act. That's the act that gives the FERC the power to do what it does. And they modified it to include some other responsibilities beyond power generation. Those things, the requirement was to equally consider the protection of recreational opportunities and the preservation and other aspects of environmental quality. So all of a sudden it became more than just a power generation capability. It became something that had to be environmentally responsible. Not a bad thing to do. Certainly there's a cost to doing that. But again, that followed from the earlier formation of the EPA and the National Environmental Policy Act. Well, starting in 1986, that's when troubles started to begin here at Smith Mountain Lake. Of course, they started really slow. They were sort of under everybody's radar because nobody was still regulating any docks or any shoreline uses in the project in 1986. So in February of 1988, the FERC issued a new article to their license. It was called Article 41. And this purpose of this article was to regulate land use and development within the project boundary. I don't think there was a big deal made about that. Nobody that was here probably understood what it was about. But that began FERC saying now it's up to the project licensee, APCO in this particular case, Appalachian Power, to begin to control uses in the project boundary. Shortly after that, in around 2000, Appalachians started to gather the counties together and talk about, we're going to be developing what they call a shoreline management plan. And from about 2001 till about 2003 or 2004, there was this group of county folks, some Lake Association folks from the Smith Mountain Lake Association, some folks from ALAC, that all sat in a room with Appalachian Power trying to understand what shoreline management was going to be. Well, in 29th of August 2003, after a couple of years of this debate with the counties, the Lake Association, and some stakeholders, Appalachian declared that they were done with the SMP, that they have a consensus, and they're going to implement this document. And that happened on the 29th of August in 2003. They published it, and what they basically said is, now everyone has to apply to us for a revocable license in order to put a dock, remove vegetation, plant vegetation, put a boat ramp in or not, put a beach in or not. Anything that any use you wanted in the project boundary, now you had to apply to AEP to get that. Up to this point in time, it was simply all an individual had to do to get a dock was to go to their county, fill out a building permit, and the county would grant them a permit. They would complete the permit, they would call the county out for an inspection, the county would inspect the dock to make sure it met their permit and met the county guidelines in the zoning ordinance. Well, it took about a year and a half after that until July of 2005, when FERC ordered Appalachian now to implement the SMP. They put their stamp on it and said, as a regulatory agency, we now approve this SMP. And if you recall, if you guys were here at the time, when they approved it, they changed something. They came back and they said, wait a minute, we're going to shut down the entire dock building business on the lake for 4 months out of the year because there's fish spawning going on in the lake. So there can be no dredging, there can be no dock piling driving, there can be no stabilization of the shoreline at that time. Well, that was a big indicator to the counties and the organization called that was overseeing this to say something's wrong here, and they protested this. Eventually had to go to Virginia Tech to get a letter from a renowned fisheries biologist to say this doesn't make any sense, and the FERC reversed itself, and they now allow dock building all months of the year. They now allow riprapping all months of the year. They only allow dredging 8 months out of the year. And the reason for that, when you go to build a dock now, if you're doing it in the spring, when fish are nesting, they make you observe and make sure there's no fish nesting underneath the pilings where you're about to drive it so that you don't damage the environment. So that happened. That should have been a big indication to people that why is this agency that lives at 8888 First Street in Washington, D.C., what do they know that we don't know? I mean, this is our project. We've certainly built it to what it was by our private investment, and all of a sudden we have a bunch of bureaucrats sitting in Washington telling us what we should be able to do with our property and not. Soon after that, Appalachian began this approach, this process to get a new license at the lake. And that license was awarded in 2010, April 1st, 2010. I remember that date. Everybody remembers April Fool's Day. But before that, they submitted a package of drawings, again, for the project to depict where the project existed, what the purpose of the project was, where the lands existed, and they detailed all of that in a set of drawings. However, those drawings didn't contain the detail, the level of detail that the drawings did in the original license. Remember, I told you back in '67, they'd submitted by subdivision every parcel that composed this lake. Well, in this particular case, they just show a diagram of the lake. They show no subdivision information. They show no ownership information. They don't show where the flowage easements exist and where they don't exist. They just simply put a note on the drawing that said, we've obtained all flowage rights for adequate operation of the project, and those ownership records reside with us if anyone has a question. So on 1st of April 2010, using that drawing and that certification, Appalachian was awarded a new 30-year license. Of course, we still had shoreline management problems, and we were involved, myself and the counties, to try to modify some of the things in the shoreline management plan to make it more agreeable to the project, make it better. We ran into a lot of trouble with Appalachian. They didn't want to change it. The FERC initially didn't want to change it. So we eventually got into the office of Senator Mark Warner and Robert Hurt, our congressman from this area, and using their political powers, they convinced Appalachian and FERC to engage in what they call an alternative dispute resolution mode, which is basically mediation. And for a year and a half, we spent trying to determine what was wrong with the shoreline management plan and how we could improve it. Everything that we asked for, we didn't get, but we did see some meaningful changes. One thing that did not change, however, was this issue of property rights. One of the very first things I brought up in the meeting when we started was that the flowage rights that people have in this lake are inconsistent with the terms of your permit. And your permit is taking rights away from folks and not compensating them for taking those rights away. AEP didn't want to hear it, the FERC didn't want to hear it, and we were unable to reach any agreement to have that permit changed. That permit is not approved by the FERC. It was something that AEP developed for the purpose of permitting docks and also changing your property rights. So in January of 2014, this new SMP was approved and put in there, but still property rights were an open issue. So that's the history, and the purpose of telling you that is so that you can see that these things were gradual. They didn't happen on day one. What we have today is much different than what the original license required. What we have today is more restrictions on your use of the lake, but the underlying documents that tell you what your rights are were never changed. And those documents, the flowage easement and your deed, travel with the land. So when you sell it, those rights go to the next buyer automatically in the chain of title. That's important to recall, and we'll discuss that a little bit later when we start to talk about what their permit is doing and why C.U.R.B and so many others, so many supporters are very upset with the way things are going.